Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today we are talking about what I read this month. As you can see, we're doing things a little bit differently this time around. Looking at cute kitties right now. And that's because first I'm going to talk about the audiobooks that I listened to. And they were very depressing, so that's why I'm going to give you guys some cat footage just to make sure that you guys aren't as super-duper depressed. And then also, when we get to the actual books, it'll be kind of a close-up picture of the book and kind of a better look at the book itself, just some footage of the actual book, instead of me just sitting there talking and showing you the book to the camera. Let me know what you think about this way of doing, especially these wrap-up videos at the end of the month. This would probably how I would ideally do them going forward, but if you don't like that, let me know, and it can be back to just me talking in front of the camera. So I read a lot this month. I read 15 books, which is a surprise. And quite a few of those were actual, like, me sitting down and reading books. I was very happy to be so productive this month. It was the only good thing about this month. This month was very bad as far as just general health goes. I was still feeling very crappy throughout the month, but I escaped through all these different worlds, and let's talk about them. So first off, let's go right into the depressing stuff. One of my first things I listened to is finish the audiobook for The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, the Most Devastating Plague of All Time, by John Kelly. Yeah, it is. It's an intimate history of a bunch of people dying, and it's horrifying. And there's a reason why I had this book like half finished, and then went back and was like, oh yeah, this book is really sad and really depressing, and hard to get through. So, so yeah. It's really good if you're at all interested in this time, and if you're all interested in the Black Death. This really goes into that story quite in depth, and a lot of it is from like journals of people from the time and how they were living through it, and getting that intimate view of just a normal person living through one of the craziest plagues of all time is very harrowing, and there's a lot of things that might ring true to you if you lived through 2020. It does seem that there are many portions of history that are cyclical, usually the worst parts, and I found that really interesting. So yeah, if you're at all interested in this as a subject, I would definitely recommend it, but it's not very happy. It's sad. It's depressing. It's a depressing book, because it basically is just like, half the population died. It just starts giving you numbers of all the people that died, and you just get overwhelmed, and you're like, oh my goodness. But it's really well written, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. It's just depressing. The next book, equally depressing, is Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, An Indian History of the American West by D. Brown. This was really one of the best history books I've ever read. Really hard to read, but important to read, just because it's a very intimate history of essentially the genocide of the indigenous population of America. It's not as focused on Canada. I would really like to get a similar book. If you have any recommendations for similar books of this vein in terms of a Canadian history of this perspective, it would be really important to read that as well. But this was a seminal piece of work and was extremely controversial when it was released, because this was originally released in, I believe it was in April of 1970, and D. Brown is pretty much deconstructing the myth of the American West about how, oh wow, it was so great, everything was awesome, and it's like, no, everything was not awesome. It was very bad. And it's really harrowing to listen to some of these. Almost all of it is just deceits and lies. And yeah, it's an important read. Not a fun read, but it's very eye-opening, and you can kind of understand the world we live in and how we got there. Oof. It's an important read. But again, that was one of those ones that I had gotten halfway through and just got completely depressed, so that I picked it up now. And then reading that right after the the entire, like, the great mortality. Yeah, I was not in a great headspace. Along that lines of just that time period, I did read, or like rather listen to an audiobook that was a really quick audiobook, and it was just the journal of a trapper, 9 years in the Rocky Mountains from 1834 to 1843 by Osborne Russell. And I thought this was just interesting to get a white perspective of what was going on and how they kind of justified some of their actions. And it's definitely racist. Obviously, I mean, I can't be that surprised. An 1830s trapper is racist, but it was really interesting to just read how life was back then from a perspective of the colonizer and how they kind of justified a lot of their actions. Not an excuse. There's nothing that excuses this, but it was really good for contextualizing a lot of what I read from the other side. Now we get to 2 true crime books I read. Oh my God, these ones are just... No, I shouldn't. I don't read true crime much anymore, and that's because it's like some of the most depressing thing of all time, because there's like no veneer of fiction. It's just, hey, this is horrible things that happened. For example, To Kill and Kill Again, the terrifying true story of Montana's baby-faced serial sex murderer by John Costin. Yeah, that title tells you everything that this book is and what it is about and how it will depress you. But luckily, it's one of the few times where one of these horrifying monsters does get a pretty enjoyable comeuppance where he really does just get the crap kicked out of him. And that was probably the most delightful thing about this book to read, is that for once it's somebody does kind of get their comeuppance from the story. And it is a very crazy story. It's really well told and intricate, but it's just, it's a well told story about some of the most horrifying things that have ever happened. And why was I reading so many of these? You'll see I kind of switch. I've bunched this together where I'm just front loading you with the most depressing stuff I read. This is not technically in chronological order, but this is the other true crime book I read, Sons of Cain, a history of serial killers from the Stone Age to the present by Peter Vronsky. This one technically did kind of come into April. I did finish this April 2nd, and that's because, I was trying to have a relaxing day, and, I would have been able to finish it on the 31st, but it was too depressing, so I had to put it off for a little bit, and I was thinking about putting it off indefinitely for a while, but I decided to listen, and I am glad I did, because, it really kind of front loads this book with a lot of just terrible stories from the past, and it's so far in the past that there's not a lot of context from the time of people who've lived there, and there's not a whole lot about it other than the horrifying monsters and what they've done. And I was like, oh my goodness, I can't, I gotta take a break from this. And then we do get in the second half of this book, once they kind of hit Jack the Ripper, there's a lot more interesting stuff, because it's the media circus and everything like that, and then there's a lot more theories presented as to why this is happening, why it was such an epidemic, especially in the 80s and 70s and 90s, the serial killer epidemic of that time period. And there's a lot of interesting things in that make it really worth reading. It's just really hard to get through that initial bunch of horrifying things. I was like, oh goodness gracious. So now we get to my fun stuff, which is when I try to do some cryptid stuff. And this is not the first cryptid book I read, but I'm putting it here because it kind of paints all the other cryptid books I've read. The Unidentified, Mythical Monsters, Alien Encounters, and Our Obsession with the Unexplained by Colin Dickey. I went into this thinking that it was going to be fun. I've read a little bit of Colin Dickey's other book, Ghostland, and that was kind of a fun tour of unexplained ghost stories, and I enjoyed that a lot. This book is not of that caliber, or that it says some crazy things. This book posits some very crazy nuts things. It calls this is what it says. It calls Bigfoot a personalized slur. And I was like, whoa, that is, what? No, for me personally, I was like, there are stories of real prospectors in the Old West who just went mad and just like stayed and lived in the woods, called like the wild man phenomena. And that's where I mostly think that most of the Bigfoot stuff comes from, with a lot of, taking a lot of indigenous legends and like shaping it to their own needs. And in this book, it really just goes like, everyone who thinks about this, everyone who believes about this, like, it's just a slippery slope until you're storming the Capitol. And I'm like, whoa-sies, no, like, what's going on here? Like, I thought this was going to be kind of fun and maybe talk about some of the explanations, and it's not very fun. And it's very much a pointedly attack against anyone who enjoys cryptids. And to the point where some of the leaps are like really hard and far ahead, and I was like, oof, I don't really like that one too much. Like, I think he posits that the reason why the Greys exist is because in the Betty and Barney Hill scenario, which is one of the most famous like things, Betty was like a civil rights activist, so she wanted to say gray so that she didn't like personify any particular race. And I'm like, well, you kind of pass by some of the other explanations. Like, if you're going to take that from a skeptic point of view, a lot of people talk about how a lot of it is inspired by an Outer Limits episode that it is eerily similar to. And Outer Limits was filmed in black and white, which means everything looked gray. Like, I think that's like a much more like logical explanation if you're going to come at it from that perspective. But it did also have some really cool and interesting and unique tales, especially about the Yeti, like when it went into the Cold War history of like Nepal and everything like that. I thought that was an amazing chapter. I thought that was really good. I liked a lot of the exploration and examinations of the lake monster phenomenon. I thought that was awesome. It's just, it does make a few leaps. Like, it's worth reading. I didn't love this as much because, again, I was kind of just hoping to have fun, and I think that there are some leaps in this, but it is well written, and I will eventually read Ghostland because I did like that book when I got to it, but this is not that. Bigfoot, America's #1 monster. Already talked about that in a video earlier this month. Real Wolfmen, True Encounters in Modern America by Linda S. Godfrey. I love Linda S. Godfrey. This is the only one of hers on audiobook that I hadn't finished yet, so I hadn't fully listened to this yet, and not because I didn't like it, but these are the ultimate, like, just enjoy a weird, wacky tales, and they're all told from a first-person's perspective. Oh, I love it. I love it, because it's just all supposedly true people seeing cryptids, and it's presented in a really interesting way, and it tackles the whole phenomenons in a way that it's just kind of fun and is non-judgmental, and just, it's just fun. It's just a whole bunch of stories that you can just kind of relax and sit back with a cup of coffee or look into the stars and listen to people's creepy tales that supposedly are true. I don't know if they're true. Oh. In the same vein, I finally read the Mothman Prophecies, by John A. Keel, and this one is pretty similar to the other book I read in that it's mostly just a whole bunch of tales of people seeing the Mothman, but this one does have some more, I would say, larger ideas that it's kind of tackling in really unique and interesting ways. I really wanted to read this because Pax, if you don't know, Pax Panic, I'll link her in a thing. She recommended, when we were talking about Bigfoot, she recommended the show Hellier, and I finally went to watch Hellier, and almost all of Hellier, they're always talking about the Mothman Prophecies. So that is a really fun paranormal exploration, like, YouTube video thing, and I was compelled to finally read the Mothman Prophecies, which I have owned forever. And this was, again, that's a really fun read and just a relaxing read. I do always just love small little tales of like just cryptid sightings or spooky sightings. I always just find it relaxing, just kind of like put it on in the background while I'm playing a video game or going for a walk, and you don't have to pay that much attention to it because a lot of the times these stories are very similar. But I really did enjoy it. Now let's dive into something completely different, and these are just personal exploration stuff. So I read 3 Adam Schultz books, and Adam Schultz is a Canadian adventurer, essentially, and they were all 3 of these books were kind of his journey into the unknown, and him doing crazy canoe rides and doing crazy things and going on incredibly interesting adventures. The first one I read, which is Alone Against the North, An Expedition into the Unknown, I didn't love that as much as the other two, and that's mainly because he kind of like deifies explorers and doesn't really talk about like the more intricate complications with exploration. And some of the explorers he talks about, he is kind of just a really like, oh wow, it's so awesome, wow, I love this stuff so much. And I'm like, okay, cool. When he's actually on the adventure, it's really cool because he's just talking about him doing crazy canoeing and doing like incredibly crazy portages to places I'll never see. So that's why Beyond the Trees, A Journey Alone Across Canada's Arctic by Adam Schultz was my favorite of the bunch that I read. And that's just almost all of it is just contained to him traveling across the Canadian Arctic alone on a canoe. And it's crazy. I really thought a lot of this stuff was just so much fun and so enjoyable. So if you're into like travel logs and just kind of like relaxing books to read, not relaxing for him. He had some crazy things happen on this journey, and there were some very scary moments of this journey. But for me, it was just like, wow, listen to him like just describe these like beautiful settings that I'll never see. So my imagination was just able to run wild. His final book that I read, The Whisper on the Night Wind, The True History of a Wilderness Legend, is not... I like this book a lot. It does add a little bit of cryptid stuff to it, which I was kind of surprised about. And it's kind of him trying to decipher cryptozoology of a very specific area of Labrador, which is an area of Canada. And he just goes with a friend on a crazy journey throughout Labrador. And this was just very fun. This is very fun. They obviously they come up with an explanation, but I'll leave that to you to read if you so dare. My last three books is going to completely go right into what I'm planning on doing next month. So I thought they'd put them all here, but I did kind of read these earlier in the month, but they inspired next month. So True Vampires of History by Don F. Glutt. This is just very, very run-of-the-mill stories about, like, vampires, supposedly true vampires through history. Very fun, very quick read. Not much to it, but fun. The two that I love, A Dream of Dracula, In Search of the Living Dead by Leonard Woolf, was fantastic and was just talking all about the vampire legends and talking all about Dracula and examining and talking about the book in very unique and interesting ways, talking to people who believe themselves to be vampires, all of that stuff. Really well written, really interesting, a lot of ruminations on life and death. I really found this like a really entertaining and moving read. Lastly, In Search of Dracula, The True History of Dracula and Vampires by Raymond T. McNally and Randu Florescu. This is a classic. In 1972, this first came out, and this was one of the first times that they ever examined the true history of the historical Dracula. And I thought this was an amazing book, and it just got me inspired to, next month, be entirely devoted to covering Dracula, Frankenstein, and other Universal monster books. So that's what I'll be doing next month, is only tackling books of that nature. And I'm very excited to do that because I have a lot. I have a lot of random stuff, and a lot of them are little shorties. So we'll see how I do. What did you guys read this month? I would love to hear how your month was for reading. Thank you guys, and have yourself a great day. And remember, like, comment, and subscribe.